Good evening, everyone. My name is Danny Hoffman, and I am the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies here at the University of Washington. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's panel discussion, Rule of Law, Democratic Transitions, and Authoritarianism in Afghanistan. Now, we always begin our school's public events, even when we hold them online, by acknowledging that the Jackson School sits on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and other indigenous peoples across the world. Now, I want to welcome and thank our distinguished panel of scholars today. In just a moment, my colleague here at the University of Washington, Dr. Aria Fani, will introduce our guests and say more about the themes for this event. But before I do that, I'd like to just stress how important and how timely this discussion is. For those of you who know the Jackson School, you know that one of our core commitments is a faith in the idea that we only truly understand world events when we're prepared to recognize diverse histories, cultures, languages, political and economic systems. And so I'm really thrilled that our panelists here today can all speak to questions of democracy, governance, the rule of law in Afghanistan from a place of deep intellectual and personal understanding, and with an appreciation for the particularities of the Afghan story. At the same time, of course, this is a moment when the future of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, and efforts to undermine the rule of law are in question almost everywhere around the globe. And so we all benefit from the opportunity to think globally about what we can learn from looking across cultural and political contexts. So I want to thank everyone here for being willing to do that important work. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Dr. Fani for moderating our panel, to Nick Gottschall and Andrea Marcos, everyone at the South Asia Center for handling the administrative and technical aspects of this event, Mark Haslam, Monique Dorman, and Madison Morgan for their assistance, and our co-sponsors, Center for Global Studies, Middle East Center, Center for Human Rights, Middle East Languages and Cultures. And of course, a huge thank you to the MESA Global Academy for giving us this opportunity. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Aria Fani, Assistant Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures here at the University of Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoffman. It really is my honor to moderate this panel discussion titled Rule of Law, Democratic Transitions, and Authoritarianism in Afghanistan. Since the catastrophic withdrawal of the US and its allies from the country in the summer of 2021, so many crises have come and gone, demanding our attention. For the past 5-6 months, the US-funded Israeli genocidal assault on Gaza is rightly occupying so much of our headspace. But Afghanistan has and will always be relevant to the region and to the world for reasons beyond its importance to empire or lack thereof. And those that are affected directly and indirectly by the state in Afghanistan, by its crisis, do not have the luxury of not giving undivided attention. And so we're really privileged to be in the presence of the panelists today that are here to educate us on a topic that unfortunately is not receiving enough attention. Our panelists are Anila Daulatzai from the University of California, Berkeley, Ramin Mansoori from the University of Pittsburgh, Mohammad Bashir Mobasher from American University, and Shamshad Pasarlay from the University of Chicago. I will go ahead and first introduce our first panelist to you, and then I will give the floor to Dr. Daulatzai. Anila Daulatzai is a political and medical anthropologist. She has conducted research in Afghanistan for 3 decades and is currently writing a book based on her long-standing research in Afghanistan. She has taught in prisons, universities, and activist spaces across 3 continents. She's currently based in my favorite city, Oakland, California. Dr. Daulatzai, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aria. Thank you so much for the University of Washington, Professor Hoffman, of course, Nick, for all your assistance in just inviting and getting all our panelists organized. I'm very happy to be here. I will aim to keep my comments, my intro comments, as brief as possible, and hope that we could just have maybe extra time to engage with one another. So what I will offer is not something I've not said or written about already, yet I feel I must continue to insist on undoing the ways we speak about and think about Afghanistan and Afghans. And I want us to perhaps make space as people thinking on and thinking with Afghans for critically examining the imperial and colonial languages and grammar that constitute how Afghanistan is discussed, how knowledge on Afghanistan becomes produced through these imperial languages and practices. And I'm not sure it's something that has to be said, but I'll say it anyway. So when I'm speaking on on us and the suggestion to focus on language, it's not a mere signaling of a language or way of speaking about Afghanistan and Afghans. That in itself is important, but is about an entire colonial structure and accompanying practice that still yet limits how we think and speak about Afghanistan. And this entire structure has had and continues to have very real and material consequences for Afghans, not only in Afghanistan, but Afghans globally scattered around the world, right? So I really appreciated how Professor Hoffman started by putting it in a global context, and that Afghanistan is not only important because of what happens in Afghanistan, but how it's connected to larger people and places elsewhere, right? And I think that's just a stunning way, as someone who runs an international studies and has that vision, right? Because for me, I think all too often we as scholars see things in only in relation to like Afghanistan in South Asia, or Afghanistan in the Middle East, or Afghanistan in Central Asia, and not Afghanistan globally, and how it relates to other structures and other practices, right? So I'm kind of trying to build on that, right? And if there had been more conversations throughout the 45 plus years of Afghan contemporary history between scholars of different regions, there may have been more critical work in the ways that I'm suggesting. So when I'm saying this and giving it as an example, right, the title of the panel, right? I mean, no disrespect for those who came up with the title or anything, but it's a way of like trying to get us in the mode in this time that we have together, of trying to think together how to start undoing the languages, or continue to undo the languages and ways that we think about a people in a place, right? So in the title, we have rule of law, right? What does the rule of law mean in general? What does it mean at a time when an active genocide is taking place? Which rules are being followed? Which laws are being upheld? In other words, we must unhinge from our collective and individual ways of thinking on Afghanistan, or quote, democracy, and quote, authoritarianism, as these words are meant to signal a certain imagination of who and what is an authoritarian and who is not, and who that designation would never apply to, right? So I say these, what I feel are rather basic points, to offer frames and ways of re-engaging with Afghanistan, especially, but not only, in the time of genocide. So some may wonder why I have now referred to the genocide in Palestine a few times now when speaking on Afghanistan. The first political rally I attended at the age of 2 was for Palestine. I was educated from a very young age of how liberation and anti-imperial struggles were connected. So when I was quite young, right, I was explained how the liberation of Afghanistan from the Soviet Empire was connected to the Black liberation movements in the US and elsewhere, and that the struggle for a free Palestine was an anti-colonial struggle. So now, as an anti-imperial scholar, I have come to understand that the liberation of Palestinians is connected to the liberation of oppressed peoples, and always has been everywhere, not just through the quest for liberation, but also against the same structure that inhibits that liberation. So as an anti-imperial scholar, I have always understood that what happens in Palestine, and well before October 7th, and in fact, several decades before October 7th, what happens in Palestine does not stay in Palestine. The practices of violence, the precise technologies of stunning brutality are learned, practiced in Afghanistan, and enacted in Palestine and elsewhere, and vice versa. New ways of killing and extermination are being built, designed, and tested in Gaza, and they have been in Afghanistan. So a drone strike in Kabul, Afghanistan, that killed an Afghan humanitarian aid worker and his family on 29th of August in 2021, on the eve of the US empire's exit from Afghanistan, was no accident. It is not just that Afghanistan and Palestine share trajectories of violence in their histories and their presence. It is that the who and the what that is currently killing and starving Palestinians is the same who and what that currently kills and starves Afghans. When Ilan Levy, the former Israeli government spokesman and international media advisor to the president, referenced yesterday the US drone strike in Kabul in August 2021 that accidentally misidentified an Afghan humanitarian worker as a terrorist to say militaries make mistakes. So when the IDF made a mistake by misidentifying the World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers, I mean, mistakes happen in war. I want to understand that he's not referencing Afghanistan to simply say, look at that other mistake that was made over there. And so we did that too. He's actually saying, look at what happened over there, and we learned that we can do it too. We can kill whomever we want and just call it a mistake. For 20 years, from 2000 to 2021, and still yet now, Afghans themselves and others who engage with Afghans speak about the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, with less to no time being given to discussions about a racialized logic and order that did not and does not even consider Afghans human. So much has been focused on the rights part of human rights and not on the human part of human rights, when Afghans are not even considered under the category of the human. The languages of human rights, rule of law, and gender were bandied about in Afghanistan so much that the English words themselves became part of the Afghan languages, especially in Kabul. Afghans particularly, but not only those working in the international NGO scene, felt something was off, felt the talk was perhaps a bit insincere, yet they still pursued the projects of Afghan rule of law and women's rights. Afghans felt betrayed in 2021 by an international system and order that promised them so much and left them with what they had in 2001, an emplaced regime. Afghans have lived it over and over and over how the rule of law was always about an international order premised on a racialized order and logic that excluded them. A system that would discipline Afghans to be mired in demonstrating various enactments of a standard that those who manage and design the system don't even abide by. So what am I saying about where and what we should do? I'm simply saying that we need to not only abandon the frames which were created and still exist to contain oppressed peoples from actually crafting their own plans and imaginations for liberation and self-determination. I want to have that conversation. And if this is not the space, or want to start beginning having these kinds of conversations with scholars of Afghanistan, and if this is not the space, then so be it. But I will continue the quest to remake space for Afghans to imagine their own individual and collective liberation and not be subject to frames and designs and orders that have ultimately not even designated them as human. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daulatzai, for your incisive analysis, connecting and having us to pay close attention to the forms of knowledge and the relationship to power. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Ramin Mansoori. Ramin's primary research interest includes comparative politics, the political history of Afghanistan, and the great power competition. Ramin's current research focuses on nation building in Afghanistan and China's Afghanistan policy. Ramin, the floor is yours. And I think you're mute. Your microphone's mute.
Thank you so much, Aria, for mentioning. I would like to thank Center of Asian Studies, University of Washington, and MESA Global Academy for providing us this opportunity to share our thoughts. I would like to talk about Afghanistan nation building issue and nation building in sense of national identity building as a domestic politics of Afghanistan. As we know, Afghanistan, we have war and instability in Afghanistan for a long time. And it has both external and internal causes, like which brought us in the conflict. And I would like to talk about the nation building issue and the way that the problem of theoretical issue of Afghanistan nation building policies. As we know, Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic countries. We are built with different ethnic groups, but we have 4 major ethnic groups in Afghanistan, which is Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazara, and Uzbek. But unfortunately, in earlier Afghanistan nation building policies, most of that ethnic groups was ignored somehow, which caused the ethnic conflict or brought the potential opportunity for these conflicts with the involvement of external powers. And this was a big issue when Afghanistan nation building the policy was starting. It was mostly based on Pashtun language and culture, but at the same time, of course, Farsi Dari language was part of that. But one of the mistakes was happening was to explain, to not explain different ethnic groups on a nation and bring the theoretical evidence for that. And especially for the 2 largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan, Pashtun and Tajiks, we all in Afghanistan, according to law, according our institution, we all are Afghan, but there is still an issue, like people were calling themselves, okay, where is the evidence why a Tajik could be Afghan when Afghan is also a name for Pashtuns? And it was possible to make it bring the historical narrative to explain both ethnic groups in one historical narrative. But unfortunately, due to the lack of information or what, maybe, I don't know, or maybe some ethnical tendency, it didn't happen, which I believe it's contributed to failure of Afghanistan nation building. Of course, Afghanistan nation building has external issues as well, and external issue was especially like the cross-border ethnicities, which is involving like in such a conflicts. Also, the direct influence or invade of great powers in Afghanistan domestic politics, which happened in 19th, 20th, and 21st century with 3 superpowers of the times. But I will come back to talk about the how we can explain like the history of 2 ethnic groups, like for example Tajiks and Pashtun in the same narrative. During my PhD works in China, I find it quite interesting narrative about Afghanistan, different ethnic groups from Chinese ancient story, that it was interesting for me how the Chinese ancient story describing as Pashtuns and Tajiks as the same nation, which is in border with China for 1,000 years. You know, of course, sometimes in border, but sometimes pretty close. But the interesting thing was we never heard about that in Afghanistan, that actually Pashtun and Tajiks sharing like 2,000 years story together. We had Tajiks used to have like tribal society or tribal system, and Pashtun still keep that. But it was Pashtun, according to Chinese story, Pashtuns and Tajiks was both part of the Daulatzai big tribe in 2,000 years ago, which was right in border of China, Qing dynasty. And it is clearly explaining how a conflict with Huns make these ethnic groups to move from East China, from west part of China to Central Asia, Bactria, and then build up the Kushan Empire. This Kushan, we all know, most of us, we know about Kushan Empire, which was it's a very early base for later different empires in the region, and especially for today's Afghanistan. But the fact that Kushan Empire was, and Kushani people was Tajiks and Pashtuns, but like in different tribes. There was different two tribes of the same nation or the same ethnic group, which we don't have it in that time. This is such a kind of narratives is very helpful for us for today's Afghanistan conflict. Like today we have in Afghanistan we have political parties based on specific ethnic groups, and they describe themselves so different than each other, but actually we are the same. So I would like to mention that like this also like early in Afghanistan, for example, Abdulhai Habibi, Afghan scholar, he talked about and he connect the Pashtun two big tribe, the Abdali and Ghalzai, to Heftali, and then later to Roger people, Daroja people. But he ignored the fact that Tajiks are also the same. So in this regard, I believe that we need today we needed to reread this such a kind of stories in order to bring up the new narrative for Afghanistan nation building, in order to build up the country and build up the country's national identity, which could be acceptable and for all ethnic groups, and especially the 2 or 4 largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan should find themselves in the identity theoretically and what strong evidence, historical evidence. Today, even in Chinese academia, scholars all focusing who focus on Afghanistan, they all clearly know actually how similar like Pashtun and Tajiks are in Afghanistan, but it needs like Afghan policymakers to work in that. So most of the time, due some lack of knowledge of policymakers or some ethnical tendency, they're forgetting about that. So this was a point that I was about to talk for today's conference. I hope it is something new or interesting. Maybe lots of you know about that, but yeah, this was my point I would like to make, and I would like to talk about that if there's any question later.
Thank you, Ramin Jan. That was a thoughtful presentation, and especially your attention to ethnicity and tribe, I feel like is something that we need to discuss further during Q&A. I have a question that I look forward to asking all of you.
Sure.
I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Mohammad Bashir Mobasher. And Mohammad's main areas of research are constitutional law, electoral design, and identity politics. He's also published long and short pieces on extremism, human rights, democracy, and discrimination laws. Most of the countries that he has studied are pluralistic societies, plural societies, including Afghanistan, Indonesia, Nigeria, Kenya, Bolivia, and Sri Lanka. His book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation, is pending publication. And please do let us know when it comes out. I very much look forward to reading it. Mohammad Bashir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Aria, I'm sorry about the problem with my voice. I guess my bio was not as much updated as it needed to be, because my book is published recently, so it's available online and in print. Thanks to the University of Washington, MESA, for organizing this event, and I'm honored to speak a little bit about the topic, well, rule of law, democratic transition, and authoritarianism in Afghanistan. It's a rather broad topic, and I would say actually it's not broad enough to include the Taliban regime, because I would consider the Taliban regime as a theocratic totalitarianism, because Taliban are not controlling just the people on the public sphere and political sphere. They are trying to control every single aspects of Afghan lives, which includes their political, economic, social, cultural aspects, what you wear, and when you walk, how you pray, and all those things are regulated by the Taliban, and you get punished if you don't follow their rules. So, but to address this broad topic, the issue of rule of law, democratic transition, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism in Afghanistan, I would like to take a more historical approach here. I am not necessarily an expert in history, but I'm fascinated by investigating the patterns of behavior that would explain why we are where we are, and what's going to happen next if we follow the same patterns of behavior and the change of events. Looking at some of the patterns of behavior across time in Afghanistan, you can identify a number of cycles of political failures in the country. And I have to say my analysis here is more inwards looking rather than outwards. In other words, I'm looking mostly at the political failures of Afghan elites and rulers rather than the problems and issues with the policies of foreign powers towards Afghanistan. So it's not comprehensive, but it's something, related to the topic. One cycle of political failures I would like to talk about is the issue of rentier state. Throughout or for the most part of the modern history of Afghanistan, which basically consolidated during the second reign of Dost Mohammad Khan. And after that, we never broke away from the cycle of a rentier state. And I would have to say, actually, it's more sort of a rentier ruler rather than rentier state, because the foreign assistance or revenues that the rulers received, they were never invested in the state infrastructures or providing services to the public. It was mostly about survival of the rulers themselves. And the patterns of Afghanistan, initially it was the British Empire, and then it was the Tsar Empire and the Soviet Union, and then it was the United States and the international allies of the United States. Now, if you look at the history of the country, you know that, well, first of all, the assistance of a foreign power is going to end one day or another. And the elites, for some reason, have ignored this very important fact. And that's why when these assistance or revenues or military and financial support ended at any point in the history, that at that particular moment led to the collapse of regimes in Afghanistan. So, for example, Amanullah Khan didn't receive support, his regime collapsed. Habibullah Khan, he never received, Habibullah Kalakoni never received support, so his regime was doomed to failure. Dr. Najib, after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union and their fall, his regime collapsed. And then the last example would be Ashraf Ghani. Even before the withdrawal of the last soldier of the United States, his regime collapsed in Afghanistan as well. And you can include, for example, the Mujahideen during the Civil War in that category, as well as Sher Ali Khan, his second reign in particular, but also his first reign. One thing I have to say about the rentier ruler or rentier state is that it's not about receiving revenues and assistance militarily or financially from a foreign power, but it's also a state of mind, a form of dominant political disposition that has existed in the political culture of Afghan elites in a way that they have always looked at the foreign powers as a savior in a way. Well, some of them, not all of them. And they have considered taking the power or their survival in power. And in a way that they can only take power or survive in power if they have the backing of a foreign power. And otherwise, when these assistance were ended, then automatically, not only militarily they were defeated morally, and you could argue psychologically as well. So Sher Ali Khan is a really good example. He had 56,000 troops, standing army. He actually created a military college. So it was a more professional army than ever Afghanistan had. And when the British Empire decided to invade Afghanistan, instead of using his army that were trained and was a professional standing army to put up a fight against the British Empire, he went to the north to get assistance from the Tsar Empire. And when the Tsar Empire didn't provide him any assistance, he got disappointed, he got sick, and then he died suddenly, without even putting up a fight against that force. And why that's relevant today? Because at least some elites among the oppositions of the Taliban are still looking at the United States, the Brits, or some other Western powers to see what they're doing with regard to Afghanistan and expecting if something must be done by the international community or the United States. And the thing is, there was the United States and the allies who delivered and surrendered Afghanistan to the Taliban, and who are in a lot of ways, diplomatically and internationally, are trying to normalize the Taliban as the rulers of Afghanistan. The other aspect, I don't know how much time I have, so I'm going to just end with one other cycle of political failure in Afghanistan, and that's the politics of exclusion. Afghan rulers have always, whenever they came to power, mostly through violent means, they thought that they're going to live and rule the country forever, so they can exclude and marginalize and persecute whatever groups that they wanted or whatever groups that they found as a threat. And that has been problematic because those same groups who were defeated and marginalized would take over next actually power and then form their own exclusive governments. And this cycle has been going on for until now. So to start with Zahir Shah, he decided to marginalize his cousin, Daud Khan, who used to be his prime minister. And his new constitution of 1964, to exclude him from power. And eventually Daud Khan started a coup, took over the power. And then Daud Khan tried to marginalize the communist regime, who actually helped him take over the power, the Khalqis and the Parchamis. He tried to marginalize them. Who took over power next? It was these communist parties, the Khalqis and the Parchamis. And when Khalqis and Parchamis took over power, they thought that they're going to rule the country forever and start building a socialist regime. But then they decided to exclude, kill, and displace the Islamist Mujahideen. They thought there are a couple of Mujahideen Islamists, so we can kill them or remove them. But then who took over next? The Islamist Mujahideen. And then the Mujahideen were not united. They were fighting each other because every single one of them wanted to rule the entire country single-handedly. And eventually they were defeated. The Taliban took over, and the Taliban decided to marginalize the Northern Alliance, the same Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen came back and took over power, and the Taliban were defeated. The Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance, plus the United States decided to exclude the Taliban. And who took over next? It was the Taliban. And the Taliban right now are excluding everyone else. And you can imagine what is going to happen next. It was going to be everyone else in the future. But I hope, I guess there is a good news and a bad news. The bad news is that the Taliban is excluding everyone else. And the good news is because they are excluding everyone else, the patterns of the history shows that they cannot survive for a very long time. But I hope what we learn from the history is that that the post-Taliban Afghan government is inclusive enough not to see another violent transition. So I'm going to end here, but we can talk about the rest of the cycles later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mobasher. I'd also like to bring to everybody's attention that his book has, in fact, been published. I'd like to advertise it right here. It's titled Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation, Institutional Design in Afghanistan. It came out just last year, December 2023, by Routledge. And Dr. Mobasher, you could pay my fee later for advertising your book. My commission's 5%. And now on to our very last panelist, Shamshad Pasarlay. Shamshad's research interests span the fields of comparative constitutional studies and institutional design in deeply divided societies. His current work explores a novel approach to constitutional engineering in post-conflict, deeply divided societies like Afghanistan, Libya, and Yemen. His forthcoming book, which may also have been published, we'll find out in a minute, under contract with Cambridge University Press, discusses the constitutional history of Afghanistan as a case study in successful models of constitutional coordination in polarized, divided societies. He's also interested in questions of Islamic law and Islamic legal history. Dr. Pasarlay's work in this field draws on the history of Afghanistan to explore the role of the pre-modern state in shaping the content and disciplining the authorities of the Hanafi school of Islamic law. And before I give the floor to him, I'd like to invite all of our members of our audience to please submit your questions to the Q&A section. When his presentation is over, we'll reconvene as a group and I'll read the questions and we'll have hopefully a very generative and dynamic conversation. Dr. Pasarlay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aria John. And just I'll take up Bashir on this as well. If Bashir owes you for promoting his book, then he owes me a lot. I've been doing some promotion for him. I just wanted to say that. Yeah, my book is not published and it's close to the end part. But I also want to thank everyone in the panel, in our audience, but specifically the Jackson School, as well as the South Asian Studies Center of the University of Washington, and the Middle East Studies Association's Global Academy for making this possible. I really was listening to all the three presentations. I really enjoyed a lot. Thank you all for such an edifying presentation. I will just bring the questions back to what is happening now. Bashir and Ramin John talked about history very comprehensively. I'll just explain what's going on currently and try to understand the policies that Bashir was talking about, like how the Taliban are like controlling literally every aspect of the social and private life, and why their policies are so oppressive in general. There's a lot to unpack there, but I would like to talk about where does the Taliban's laws or the qanuns come from, and from where they are inspired, and how does that then informs their approach to governance. And I will discuss just one doctrine that the Taliban seem to have taken very seriously and very centrally in governing the country in the way they are. And that is the doctrine or the principle or the notion of Amr bil Maruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, or commanding the good and forbidding the evil. As part of this, there is that's one, and the second one, that's the doctrine that seems to be very central to the Taliban's approach to governance. And I would also add and argue that it's really flawed at the way the Taliban have understood and applied it. So the doctrine includes a duty of Muslims against each other and Muslims against state, and a reciprocal duty of the state against the Muslim to oversee, to command each other to implement divine commands and prohibitions. And there is some potential, and I think Professor Clark Lombardi, who is in the audience, is actively currently looking at this doctrine and whether that's kind of a constitutionalist doctrine where it could hold governments accountable to the people. I'll come to that part a little later. So now this is part of it. The other part, in a lot of different places, in private meetings and interviews, in declarations, the Taliban say that we are on a path to make sure that God's commands are implemented in Afghanistan, and that's what we are doing. It's these principles, these ideas that inform the Taliban's approach to questions of law. Now, what is law or qanun for the Taliban? For the Taliban, law is the Sharia, and its norms in every conceivable act basically is given in its primary sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. They also understand that this is a classical notion of Islamic law, that God has not given all these commands and prohibitions clearly and ready-made to be received by the people and applied. Some of them require some sort of legal reasoning, engagement in some interpretive exercise to understand what God means, or what are the precise commands and prohibitions of God that should be applied to in the world of the Muslim's duty. How do the Taliban find it? Now, the Taliban find it by looking at the works of the classical jurists, the Hanafi school particularly. in areas then that they have actively designated certain books of Hanafi law and have required courts to apply them to resolve cases. And even in areas where they legislate, they make a qanun. So in principle, for the Taliban, the state will not really have a lawmaking power, but it's more, as Professor Clark Lombardi and Andrew March put it, it's more a discovery function. The state must discover the law, should not make it, or it does not have the authority to make it, because legislative authority is reserved only to God. And the state is in no position to make the law, but it should discover it. And where do they discover it? As I said, in the works and writings of the classical Hanafi jurists. I will give in the areas where they do publish, promulgate something that they call qanun, or an order on a decree or the law. They make a lot of references to the works of the Hanafi scholars, to the Quran and to Hadith. And I have a couple of examples that I want to show us in our audience. And here's one of the examples, if you can see my screen. This is one of the examples where this is a law that's called Qanun Sam Shikayat, which could be translated literally as the law of hearing citizens' complaints. And if you look at each of these provisions, whatever the hukum says in the law, they will have a reference for whether to some explanation, but also some classical works of the Hanafi school that will be referenced to these laws. Simply, in other words, showing that these are also in some ways, these are all the references, the books of Hanafi law that have been referenced. Some of them are explanations, some of them are simply citations in references to these works. What is it? This is one example. The other example, this is a more like a law that asks citizens to submit their complaints against, presumably, I'll come to this, against the state officials if they violate the law, or in other words, if they don't enforce God's commands or prohibitions in society. So that's the line. I'll come to that. This is another law that's not that talks about an institution. It has like a very tricky name, both in Dari and in Dari it's like more clear, but in Pashto it has a very strange name that cannot be even read or translated. But this is an institution that basically has the power to make sure that the Taliban's leaders' decrees, orders, and laws are implemented. So it's like an oversight institution that oversees the implementation of the decrees, ahkams, orders, advice, guidance of the Taliban leader that comes out of Kandahar. Both, but it's more like with state institutions, not necessarily citizens, because there's a different institution for that, the Ministry of Commanding Good and Forbidding Evil, or the Amr bil Maruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Ministry was doing that more, but it shares the job. That's the same in state institutions, also vis-a-vis the citizens as well. So here you will also see some explanation that then in Arabic, ironically, because they're trained. So this is one example of Raddal. So that's like one of the books of Hanafi law. So this is like, if you scroll down to these types of laws, you see this all of them are like given references to the classical works. Now, why do I give these examples? Just to show that for the Taliban, the law is the Hanafi law. This is the supreme law of the land. Does the state make it? Not necessarily, but it finds it. It has to find it in the writings of Hanafi scholars. Can we call this rule of law something else? I honestly don't know. Maybe not, perhaps. That's the question of law, to just bring it a little there. And then the second one is, the second part of this, what I want to say is more about the Taliban's approach to governance or their political vision. And I also will talk just on one aspect of it. And that also comes out of the principle of this notion of commanding the good and forbidding the evil, based on Sharia, based on Islamic law, what is good in Sharia and what's evil in Sharia, as understood by the Taliban, which may be different from the way we would understand them. That's that reciprocal duty of the state vis-a-vis the citizen to make sure that God's law is implemented. It is also includes a component that's the duty of the citizen to do exactly the same thing against the state or the ruler. In a lot, the Taliban are presenting this law that they recently adopted and published. How that was adopted is a different method that they use, procedure that they use that differs wildly from the procedure that we would normally see for legislative documents. But they publish this in the official gazette, and the idea of this is the Ministry of Amr bil Maruf will now receive complaints from the citizens. And that seems to, the law seems to paint a very romantic picture of it. As a citizens, you can bring a complaint to this ministry against any state official who engages in unlawful behavior, let's put it in these terms. Or does not do his, in other parts, by extension, does not do the job of enforcing God's laws or commanding good and forbidding evil in society. The ministry will then now take up this complaint, and then they will tend to resolve it. And if there are any remedies, we'll think if this is a matter that needs to go to courts, they will then simply refer that to the courts. In constitutional law, as a constitutional adjudication, this seems like closer. I wouldn't say similar, but this seems to be something that we know as individual complaints mechanisms in certain countries, where individuals can challenge the constitutionality of a legislation and then bring it before apex or constitutional courts. This is not exactly that, but it seems to have that idea in it. I'm not drawing any parallels or any inspirations from that, but just something for the purpose of understanding it a little better. Now, the duty of enforcing the other part of the Amr bil Maruf, that's like in Nahyan al-Munkar, is also that this, as I said, the citizen's duty to enforce it against the ruler. If your ruler is not doing his job. But here, the Taliban's ruler is simply untouchable. He is, I don't know, he's like a dictator, not responsible or accountable to anyone, but will exercise all types of powers. There's nothing in this law that would suggest or says in some ways that you could bring a claim against the Amir. No, the Amir simply stands out of the law and above the law and outside the ordinary institutional framework. This is more about the ministries and administrations that tend to operate in Kabul. Now, in both, this doesn't seem to be to be what the principle initially, that the principle's complete meaning is. It's been applied in the Taliban state, if there is one, in this way, that it gives the ruler immense powers, but doesn't really give the power to the citizen or to those who are governed. But that's why it doesn't. The Taliban do suggest that this is more a doctrine that's inspired by the Sharia. That's not true. That's not, at least to put it minimally, is that this is just true in part, but it's not complete. So to just conclude, it's these types of principles from the classical Islamic tradition that the Taliban seem to have revived and used the technology or the institutions of the modern state that they have inherited in some way to kind of give them some force in polity. and what it has done to the country, to the people, to those who are governed. I think I don't need to say anything about that because that's so obvious. Yeah, I'll stop here and then I'll be happy to answer to any questions there may be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasarlay, for your presentation, and I very much look forward to also reading your book when it's published. I believe at this time we will reconvene as a panel, and again, I encourage our audience members to form their questions and post them to the Q&A section. I take advantage of my position and pose the first question to all of you. I'm really, I'd like to welcome the framework that Professor Daulatzai suggested, which is to rethink all the categories. And in that vein, I'd like to ask you, in what ways is it productive to understand society and politics in contemporary Afghanistan through the categories of ethnicity and tribe? Because these two concepts, insufficiently problematized, often posing as timeless, as somehow stable across time and place in Afghanistan, which I think Professor Daulatzai would rightly argue that is a byproduct of colonial forms of knowledge. Are often invoked anytime Afghanistan and its failure in the view of those that adhere to the nation state framework. This is why Afghanistan keeps failing to build a state. So to reiterate my question, for those that even reject the premise that the nation state has to be the only model that can accommodate democratic governance and values of plurality, in what are the limits of understanding Afghan society and politics through the categories of ethnicity and tribe? And please do offer your own understanding of these categories.
Can I just break the silence, just share my thoughts to just, I mean, what was it? Mount Stuart Elphinstone came in the start of the, was it 19th century, in the 1810s and 15s, and kind of looked around the people, see what they are, and then wrote these two-volume books about the account of the Kingdom of Kabul. And then we started to kind of contest what this country, this region, these people are, and we still do that. And sadly, I see Ramin will be in a better position to speak to this, but we see that discourse still kind of dominant in modern Afghan politics. Who is an Afghan? Elphinstone seems to have come up. This is what this has been depicted like. All right, I see this group of Pashtuns living here. They call themselves Afghanistan. I will call it Afghanistan, and then the Afghans, and then there's no country known like the name Afghanistan. I will call it the Kingdom of Kabul, and then later on that the history is. All of us know that, like, well, then Afghanistan is the creation of colonialism. But to come to your question, I will just make 2 points. One is that I think we not only for Afghanistan but even broader, I don't think that the framework or the paradigm of nation state is the only paradigm through which to understand certain types of societies. There are societies who are very maybe democratic, abide by the rule of law, stable. They're not necessarily nation states, or they could be something what Alfred Stepan called a state nation, not necessarily a nation state. So I think we do need to kind of broaden our horizons and maybe political scientists will be in a bit better position to talk about this more, to understand places like Afghanistan particularly, but any other types of societies that are segmented, where there's no unified nation or a unified identity that prevails. The second one is the lens of ethnicity and tribe useful in approaching Afghanistan? I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it still gives us something to at least to understand the place through its history. That's one. And no, but no, in the sense that it's not sufficient. It's not enough to kind of. It does not give us a complete picture of this place, and not that's one reason that the idea that we have, like, there are some misconceptions that prevail on when it comes to talking about Afghanistan. And Thomas Barfield like really puts it nicely when he says that the Afghans themselves saying we are the graveyard of empires, we may have to rethink that. Bashir has done work on this, like President Biden saying every time Afghanistan can never be put together, cannot be put together because it's so deeply divided. And I think that notion is like fundamentally flawed. The country has been put together in the past, if not through the different policies, through accommodation, cooperation during Ahmad Shah, and then more through force and violence during Abdurrahman Khan. Again, I don't want to talk too much, but I think that will be my reflections on it. We do need to kind of broaden the horizon through which to kind of look at this country.
If I could just quickly add to that, Dr. Fani, thank you so much for your question. I really appreciated it because it's a very important way to just start off the conversation, right? I appreciated Dr. Pasarlay's answer as well, especially in terms of, just thinking about in your comment, Dr. Pasarlay, about the different spaces that don't inhabit necessarily the structure of a nation state, but that are quite democratic in themselves. I would want us to also look at those that claim to be democratic or democracies and that have immense social injustice and radical inequality, right? Including the United States, including Israel, including India, right? So these are the three places that have very big claims and stakes in the concept of democracy and have radical inequality to the point of extermination. Right, as an anthropologist and as an anthropologist on the panel, I will have to add that I've been trained to fundamentally question the notion of the nation state and to instead focus on the violence that structure has enacted in the lives of people, right? So, for example, in Afghanistan, and why it's important, Aria, why your comment in framing our Q&A is I think so generative, is because it allows us with our various different expertise to weigh in, right? So for me, it's precisely what you said, Aria, about how the ways the tribal structure or ethnic structure has been used by imperial powers in the past and contemporarily to explain failures in Afghanistan. So instead of focusing on how the US empire completely and utterly eviscerated ecologies and ways of life and living in Afghanistan and made Afghans scattered globally and be subject to the carceral regime of borders continually for the rest of their lives, right? It's explained away by saying, well, we didn't fail, US empire didn't fail. It's just because it's just a country that's full of all of these tribes and ethnicities, and we underestimated that, right? So, and if you read the US documents, not only on the war, but not only on the withdrawal, but on the war itself, right? It's rife with references to right? And so, and when you're, and I really appreciated Dr. Pasarlay when you started, you know, with books written, you know, by the first sort of ethnographers of Afghanistan, right? The imperial ethnographers and stenographers, right? Those were read by U.S. administrators. Let's not think that it wasn't. Those were read by U.S. administrators, and it was their playbook, right? So when people talk about how messy the withdrawal was and how, you know, with little and critique of the withdrawal, but not of the war, right? For me, that just very clearly signals how closely every single administration, so it's not like a change between Obama and Biden or between Trump and Biden, right? It's how every single administration had that playbook and had no power, no problem referencing the tribal nature, the ethnic structure, and how it was kind of doomed to fail, and how rife that is with Islamophobia, but so many other racist caricatures of Afghans themselves. It explains their violence, explains away their violence and what they've done to even like land and ecologies and whole ways of being and living. I mean, Afghans don't and can't even cook the same. Like even if I wanted to do a project on like cooking, how war and 45 years of war have changed fundamentally how Afghans even cook in the kitchen. It's quite stunning, right? So I'll stop there, but I really appreciated the comment by Dr. Pasarlay and the question. Thank you.
Dr. Mobasher, please go ahead.
All right, so just to add to what my colleagues said, I think it's important to make a difference between identity and then the politicization of identity. And if you look at the history of the country and the region, the Central Asian region and the South Asian region, you have a great many examples where the politics, the rulers have been from different identity groups, but they have not tried to bring up, you know, their ethnicity and identity into their politics or try to assimilate a group or force and displace other groups, although there has always been violence. But you have a great many examples where the rulers actually adopted the literary and the religion of the conquered population as a art of rulership. So in a lot of ways, you can find these examples where ethnicity and identity has been separate from the politics of the rulers. The politicization of ethnicity consolidated in the region as the result of colonialism, and it came into the vernaculars of the elites of the region. So the rulers of the country and the elites of the country, whether they were the rulers or the opposition to the rulers, did use identity for the political purposes to agitate different ethnic groups and to mobilize different ethnic groups. So just give you one example based on the research project we had on the issue of federalism and unitarism. This particular concept has been very much politicized, and as a result of which it has also become ethnicized, where if you talk about federalism, for most people from the Pashtun community, it means the disintegration of the country, and it means the annexation of the country by neighboring countries. So it has been given that meaning by the elites of the Pashtun communities. For example, non-Pashtun communities, Hazaras and Tajiks, unitary state has been given the meaning of ethno-authoritarianism. In other words, the dominance of Pashtuns over these other groups. But then we try to, so these concepts have been given different meanings, misconstrued and given politicized. So we did a research project about this, and there has been a number of surveys where people were asked whether you like federal or unitary system, and you can pretty much correlate the identity of groups to their preferences of these political systems. But then in our survey, what we tried to do was to, instead of using these politicized and misconceptualized concepts of federalism and unitarism, we asked them the underlying values and institutions of the political system. So we asked them, do you like to have an elected governor, an appointed governor, or a governor that had to be elected by the provincial council? Or we asked them, for example, do you want your governor or your provincial council to have more power, less power, or the same level of power as they have? And then we listed a number of authorities where we asked them to just tell us who should have these authorities, the central government, the local government, who should have it. And once you do that, once you basically de-ethnicize, depoliticize the question, then you can find concurrence and you can find consensus among different ethnic groups because they have the same experience with local administrations. And therefore, they're going to give you most likely the same answers. But because these concepts have been politicized and ethnic groups have been mobilized on these concepts, then, for example, federalism and unitarism, you can easily correlate different ethnic groups to these concepts. While if you ask them what is federalism or what is unitarism, again, they either gave you the meaning of, for example, disintegration of Afghanistan, or they just don't know what it means, but they just support it one way or another. Yeah, thank you.
I will quickly respond to that question. I believe it is the power shaping things in international politics. So when Western hemisphere was powerful, then they talk and their narrative would be dominantly accepting everywhere. This is the fact, actually. And today we have like, and this is the reality. Actually, we in Afghanistan, for example, during Ahmad Shah Durrani, we had great Afghan empire, which was quite powerful in the region. But of course, later it was the conflict inside the Durrani family, and then big great powers involvement in South Asia, also Chinese Qing Empire. The involvement make Afghanistan, the empire slowly get weakened, and then the Afghanistan issues narrative went to somewhere else, and we should hear from somewhere else because we was not able to speak in behalf of us, and that was because Afghanistan was not powerful anymore. And the nation state, this order basically is not very like it came from Westphalia, like at 1648, and it could be a good order, but it put lots of works on policymakers, especially in terms of nation building, not in terms of and not nation building that we understand from U.S. foreign policy that you do somewhere and then you change the government and then build up stuff like that. This is like part of U.S. foreign policy. But what I'm thinking on nation building is much more about domestic politics, which is the people of the country deciding for themselves, like there would be dialogues, who we are and how we build it. And this we failed in Afghanistan. Of course, there was a lots of issue and lots of like fact that why we failed, but basically it was war and instability. When there is war, like scholars, academic words, or to provide an academic narratives requires a very calm and and good area, like to keep thinking about that. But when you're in war, you would never be able to think about that. Yeah, and I just want to say like how we and the modern Afghanistan builder is literally Abdurrahman Khan. But if you know Abdurrahman Khan, in one side he built the state, another side he killed the nationalism of Afghanistan, because he was in power and the support of Great Britain, and the Afghan nationalism was against that. So he was fighting against any ideology who bring all Afghan together against someone else, which other countries build up their own nationalism. But he built up the country, and it result, even so far in Afghanistan, we don't have nationalism, but we have ethno-nationalism. If I'm a Tajik nationalism, it's likely I'm a Tajik ethno-nationalist. And if I'm a Pashtun nationalist, likely I'm a Pashtun ethno-nationalist. We cannot define Afghanistan nationalism, but for all Afghans, because theoretically, it doesn't exist so far.
Thank you. We have a few questions that hopefully we can get through. I will begin with Stephen Dada or Dada. I apologize if I mispronounce your surname. The question is for Dr. Bashir. From all indications, it appears that the ethnic division has done a lot of damage to the unity of Afghans. Do you think having a government of national unity is possible? And they've also mentioned Dr. Pasarlay's name. So either one of you can chime in the interest of time, not both.
All right. Thank you very much for your question, Stephen. Well, we did experiment with a couple of national unity government. I'm so sorry, the light is going automatically here. I have to
Stand up.
You get it. I couldn't go home because I didn't have time to be there. So I'm in a classroom right now. We experimented with a couple of national unity governments, right, during the Ghani's first and second term in office. In 2004, the election was rigged. Both Abdullah and Ghani didn't like each other to be the president, so they wanted to run their own government. So eventually, they had to get together and get along, sign an agreement that they're going to form a national unity government. And then in 2019, the same thing happened. They formed a national unity government. So it's not necessarily about forming a national unity government. It's about what to do with that national unity government. And what Ghani did wasn't any good about it, because he tried to, once he formed the national unity government, then he started trying to marginalize the portion that was appointed or decided by Abdullah, or he tried to, in some ways, marginalize the coalition that came with Abdullah and were part of the cabinet. Either he moved them or he created parallel institutions and councils and inside his presidential palace and called them, I don't know, High Council of Finance or whatever. And then they were doing all the stuff that the ministry had to do, but the ministry was run by someone who was appointed by Abdullah, and he didn't like Abdullah or anyone who came with Abdullah in his government. So I would argue that a truly national government a national unity government could function and could work in Afghanistan. And what do I mean by that? I mean that at least three things happens. And that's what I explain in my book. First, they all have to see themselves reflected in the government and represented in the government. And I'm not talking about descriptive representation in the sense that they see their elites, Muhakkik Dostum, Ghani and so on in the government, and they are fine. They also have to see that the laws that are passed by the government, the decisions that are made by the government, they are also inclusive. And what I found in my book, and I explain it in great detail, is that you could actually see a very inclusive government across 4 administrations. You could actually look at we don't have census of different ethnic groups. We have only estimates of different ethnic groups, but less or more different ethnic groups are represented proportionally in the government. But the laws that were passed by the government were not inclusive. I looked at least 21 laws where different ethnic groups had different claims, different concerns, different voices, and different interests. But most of the laws that were passed either favor one ethnic group or the other ethnic group. So if you just are thinking about descriptive representation of different ethnic groups in the government, that's not going to satisfy different ethnic groups, and that did not satisfy ethnic groups. They even in the National Unity Government of Ghani, you still had representatives from different communities, except for the smaller groups. You could see representatives from the 4 large ethnic groups, none of the other ethnic groups. But most of the laws were exclusive, disfavoring different ethnic groups. You can start from ID card laws, higher education laws, laws about decisions about where the power route has to go through, and all these decisions. Issue of election laws. So ethnic groups were not happy, they were not satisfied, and there was they felt being alienated by the government, and that's why they didn't like the Taliban, but they didn't like to work with the government to fight the Taliban. They started their own fragmented fronts in different parts of the country, which was not successful because it was fragmented.
No, Dr. Pasarlay, I rudely suggested that only one of you answer the question, but please go ahead if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, not on that since Dr. Bashir covered it very comprehensively, but I will just quickly address the question I think I read was about the Amr bil Maruf, if that's like common to the other schools as well. It seems that it is, and I say this in the 1980s, during the Soviet invasion and then the subsequent civil war, all these Islamist groups, as they are called, prepared draft constitutions for Afghanistan. The Harakat Inqilab Islami, a Shia Islamist movement, they were the first to write one, and they did codify this doctrine in their draft constitution. And the same was true with the Rabbani's government and their constitution, which came out in 1992. I think they also codified this. This is a Sunni Islamist movement, supposed similar in their ideologies, but the Taliban, but something is different there. In the Taliban, when they wrote a draft constitution in 1998, they wrote this. In the Hizb Wahdat Islami, another Shia groups, political movement, which is ideologically different than the Harakat, they also wrote a draft constitution and they did codify it. So it is common to these Islamist movements within Afghanistan, but how that is exercised and translated in practice, what tools are needed, what tools the citizens need to enforce that duty against the state, then the sides then differ a lot on that question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasarlay. And there is one last question by an anonymous attendee. For how long has there been relative peace in Afghanistan? If any, can you say the country is stable, or is there polarization brewing? And I'll go ahead and assign it to Dr. Mansoori.
So the nature of Afghanistan politics somehow built up on a buffer state between Great Britain and later Russia and Soviet Union. As long as we keep a balanced foreign policy in Afghanistan, we have peace. The good example is during the King Zahir. And the moment that we switch the side or win somewhere, we are going to fight war and instability. In this regard, I would like to say that instability in Afghanistan mostly coming, it's like the involvement of great powers in Afghanistan. It has nothing much to do with Afghanistan domestic politics, which also I mentioned that we have issues, but it's not as much just bring us to endless conflict. It is the conflict of great powers' interests in Afghanistan in the region who make Afghanistan different political party become a proxy and then fight. So the instability in Afghanistan started during the establishment of Pakistan, which Afghanistan was against that, but international society was supporting that, and then brought Afghanistan in a conflict with global West. And later Afghanistan, in order to get much more powerful and find someone, like they went to Soviet Union, and Soviet Union has their own expectation. So we fall either in West side or East side in this non-balanced foreign policy till now bring us in a very unstable situation. And I would like to mention that today's Taliban is also the issue with Taliban, of course, without Afghanistan, domestic issue, their legitimacy and stuff like that. There's like no one officially recognizing Taliban it is because of United States. So if United States allowed the second day with a free country would recognize Taliban like Pakistan, China, they're willing to do that. But because of the fact that Taliban should make clear their positions, whether either they stand with West or East and what's their position. And so far they try their best to establish like their Afghan power, and they're not able to do, and they're not legitimate. There's their issues, but I would just stop here that the conflict of great powers in Afghanistan bring instability in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Dr. Mansoori. So we have 2 minutes, and I think we potentially can go over 2-3 minutes, but out of respect to all your time and that of our attendees, we have 2 questions that I hope that we can give brief answers to. So one is Mr. Abdul Wajid Wahidi, and that's to Dr. Pasarlay. Can you elaborate on the role of Pakistani ulama in Afghanistan? As far as I know, Taqi Usmani is heavily involved in shaping Islamic rulings in Afghanistan under the Taliban. An example which would be his visit with his entourage to Kabul after the fall of the Republic government. He was treated as if he was the actual ruler and not Habibullah. Why do Taliban refer to ijma? Currently, there is no central command for fatwa.
Yeah, that just quickly for the second one first. I honestly, this is really difficult to see what do the Taliban refer to when they say ijma. But my hunch will be that when they say that, they don't mean the modern day ijma. So they would mean the classical time, the ijma of the Sahaba or so. So that will be my answer to this. On the question of the Taqi Usmani, I don't know if he is the actual ruler or not, but there seems to be the Pakistani ulama have always played a huge role in shaping, to some extent, the Afghan ulama as well. And considering that a lot of the Taliban leaders are trained in the Deobandi madrasas along the border, have been trained there, studied there will be a very deep link. Is it to the extent that Taqi Usmani will be the actual ruler? I don't think so. That will be my very brief response to that.
I think we only have a few seconds. Dr. Daulatzai, would you like to?
I only wanted to add to that about the concept of ijma, right? And it's not only limited to the Taliban's definition of that, right? In the many scholars in the Muslim world are having their consensus on what the Taliban is doing and speaking against the Taliban and what they're doing, right? So it's not only the Taliban's concept of ijma that is relevant, or even the people in Pakistan and Pakistani ulama, right? It's broader Islamic scholars throughout the Muslim world, and they are bringing out rulings which I think are important to follow and to pay attention to. That's all.
It was an honor to be alongside you. I learned so much, and I look forward to engaging you in the future. Thank you, Doctors Mansoori, Daulatzai, Pasarlay, and Mobasher. Thank you for being there.
Thank you so much.
Audience.
Appreciate it.
Thank you to you too, Aria, for being a wonderful moderator.
Thank you all.